So tonight, brothers and sisters, we are continuing our study of the 12 disciples of the English Bible, and we've gotten all the way down to number 11, William Whittingham. And William Whittingham is the hero of the Geneva Bible. And this is a replica of the Geneva Bible that is the pulpit Bible. And then we also have a replica of the octavo, which is 1/8 of the size of the pulpit Bible. And we'll talk a little bit more about the Geneva Bible as we go along, but let's introduce William Whittingham. So his background, this is of course a picture of him. He was born at Chester, England, about 1524. By 1540, at the age of 16, he entered Brasenose College, Oxford, graduating with a BA. And even though it seems like this is a misspelling, that's how they said Brasenose and how it continues to be. This is actually the door knocker on the main hall at Brasenose College. And that college still exists today, and it's a British college that is mainly attended by the well-to-do. And so that particular college he was able to get into because his mother's family was from a wealthy family. And so he graduated with his BA from there. And then in 1547, he became a senior student of Christ Church, Oxford, earning his MA on the 5th of February, 1548. So still a young man, and he's gotten his BA and his MA at Oxford. Then in 1550, he traveled for 3 years to study languages and civil law. He went to France, studying at the University of Orleans and Paris. Now, we've heard Paris and University of Orleans before, and that was sort of the place where it was still such a liberal arts environment that you could discuss things as students and teachers that they didn't allow the average person to get into. And this is where University of Orleans, several of our reformers started getting the bug of Reformation at the time. And towards the end of 1552, Whittingham studied at universities in Germany and Geneva. And of course, we know who was in Geneva at the time. Our good friend John Calvin. And so he was introduced in Germany and in Geneva to the Lutheranism and the Reformed movement in Geneva. And so in 1553, he had become a Church of England not priest. He hadn't quite gotten to that point of ordination yet. But at the same time, he was a graduate from Oxford in that area, and he was influenced heavily by this continental idea of Reformation. He returned home, but the accession of Bloody Queen Mary made his ministry as a Bible preacher impossible. After a few weeks, he himself left England with clandestine difficulty by way of Dover to France. And so what all of that is saying is he went back home and he was too liberal anymore to stay there. And he was not only too liberal for the Anglican church that had already begun, but he was too liberal. I say that by the fact that he was not Catholic and he was not even Church of England. And so she was Catholic, and the whole country was in an uproar of civil religious war, Protestant versus Catholic. And so he knew that people like John Rogers were being burned at the stake, and others were coming up to that. And so he fled back to the continent via Dover to France. So, in God's grace, in the spring of 1554, Frankfurt was the ecclesiastical center for the English Christian exiles. So we have a map here with all this area that has become Lutheran now because of Martin Luther. Remember, Martin Luther was in the 15-teens, 1520s, 30s. By this time, in the 1550s, Martin Luther has left the scene, and so has John Calvin. But we have the Lutheran movement that has now taken over this area, and Frankfurt's here in the middle, and then Calvinist area down here in the Swiss Confederation, and then down below them as a buffer between the Swiss Confederation and the Italian Popish dominion, you had the Waldensians and the Anabaptists, our spiritual forefathers. And so there is a lot of turmoil going on, a lot of fighting, a lot of civil wars between not only the people in England, but in France as well, in Spain, and all around in here. So it was a time where, we in America have never had a situation where we have been truly religiously persecuted. We've always been able to have more of a live and let live religious mentality, and it's based on our laws, based on this book, specifically this version of the Bible, and we'll get to that later. So this is the situation that they find themselves in. Well, Whittingham in 1554 finds himself in Frankfurt, and guess who else is there? John Knox, the Scottish Presbyterian. And John Knox and William Whittingham have a real friendship because John Knox is really fiery, and he's really, in-your-face kind of person about his religion. William Whittingham is a scholar, and he's very interested in making sure that John Knox has all the biblical information for his religion, his denomination that he can have. So they meet in Frankfurt, Germany, in the English Presbyterian Church. There was an English Presbyterian church headed by John Knox there in Frankfurt at the time. And then they became so close that Whittingham was ordained as a Presbyterian minister, ordained by John Knox. Now, wouldn't that be neat to be able to say, I was ordained by John Knox, or any one of the brilliant fathers? But about that time, you'll notice the last thing on this slide, Knox was chased out to Geneva. Well, it so happened that they had a Presbyterian church, but it was kind of like an English Anglican Presbyterian church. There were a lot of Englishmen that were on the continent and in Frankfurt at that church that really loved their English church. And so they loved the Book of Common Prayer that still had a lot of Catholic things in it. Sayings, doctrines, prayers that were Catholic. And so John Knox started preaching against the Book of Common Prayer, because what does it say here? The Book of Common Prayer and administration of the sacraments. We're getting back into Catholicism with all the sacraments. Well, they loved the ceremonies of the church that the sacraments represented, and many of them wanted to stick with that. And John Knox said, we got to get rid of that Book of Common Prayer altogether and just go with what the Bible says and have our own Book of Common Prayer that's our own Bible, and not mixing recipes with the Catholics. Well, it got to such a head, and there were such people that gave a lot of money for that particular movement in the day, that the money people won out and kicked John Knox out of Frankfurt. They said, you're exiled from Frankfurt, and we don't want you here anymore. So he went to Geneva to be in the Swiss Federation. And so then William Whittingham eventually joined him in Geneva. And he was elected a Presbyterian elder on 16 December 1558, was ordained as a deacon, and in 1559 he succeeded Knox as Presbyterian minister at Calvin's insistence. So Knox had started another church there in Geneva that was more of an English Presbyterian church without the Book of Common Prayer. And Whittingham had joined him a few months later, and then Knox went back to Scotland. He could go back to Scotland and not be bullied by Bloody Queen Mary. And so he went back, and then Calvin said, you guys got to have William Whittingham as your preacher. And they said, okay, you're John Calvin, we'll do it. So upon Queen Mary's death, most of the exiles at Geneva returned to England. But Whittingham remained to complete the translation and printing of the Geneva Bible in 1560. And we're going to talk about all of the importance of that Geneva version of the Bible shortly. And then so he kind of stayed almost alone to do the final commentaries, compiling, editing, setup, and printing of the Geneva Bible. In 1557 for the New Testament, and 1560 for the whole Bible. And in 1561 he did go back to France, and he was appointed to attend the English embassy to the French court as translator and chaplain. They didn't have any place for him right after Bloody Mary was taken care of. It was still kind of in an uproar as to who would be at what church at what time, so he didn't have in 1561 an immediate place. So he took a job in the French court as translator and chaplain there for a couple of years. But in 1563, he returned to England, and he was assigned as the Dean of Durham. Whittingham held 2 services a day, also devoting much time to his grammar school and song school and writing church music. He set many psalms to music and wrote commentaries. So he wasn't just a Bible man. He came back to England at a time where they needed to have unity, and they needed to feel like brothers and sisters together. And nothing does that better than music, when you can sing in unison together. And he wrote lots of early music in the Anglican Church, and he had a song school where students would come to learn how to do a metric version of the Psalms. And in those days, and it even translated over into America at the time, the way they would sing, they didn't have one leader. The brothers and sisters would all get together, and the brothers would be on one side and the sisters would be on the other side. And they would all start out, and they would start out with their hand up like this. And then they'd start singing the song, and they'd say, "Blessed be the tie that binds." And they would all do the hand movement together to keep everybody in step. And so they did that, and that's how they did. And the brothers were on this side doing it, and the sisters were on this side doing it. And sometimes they would have because of Whittingham, they would have parts. And the brothers would be doing, "Blessed be the tie." And the sisters would be doing, "Blessed be, blessed be, blessed be." And so they were doing parts, and they started really getting into it. So we're thinking about adopting that here, but I haven't talked to the deacons about that yet. In 1564, Whittingham protested against the old popish apparel and theology. He refused to wear the vestments of the Anglican ministry. Thus, proceedings by church officials were begun against him in 1566. So he had a couple of years of preaching, but he wouldn't wear the vestments. He wouldn't wear, it looked like he was, the big cheese. He didn't like that. So he would come in his regular black suit and wouldn't wear the frock. And he didn't like their Anglican theology either. It wasn't Presbyterian enough. It wasn't biblical enough. And so they started actual proceedings against him because he was a rogue. In 1577, however, he incurred the enmity of the new Archbishop of York by resisting his visit to Durham Cathedral. And I'll stop here and say the new Archbishop of York they were building this whole hierarchy of the Anglican Church based on the model of course, the Catholic Church. So they had this whole Anglican priest archbishop hierarchy, and this new archbishop was kind of using his position as the power position to put all the guys in play that were his guys and get rid of the guys that weren't his guys. Well, Whittingham wasn't one of his guys. And so he said, I'm going to come visit you at the Durham Cathedral. Well, Whittingham knew what that was. It was him wanting to listen in on his sermons and wanting to make him toe the mark. So he said, you can't come visit I'm the dean of Durham and you can't come visit. Well, that didn't go over. That went over like a lead balloon. And so he started making allegations against him, and the allegation against Whittingham was the alleged inadequacy and invalidity of his ordination in Geneva. He was removed from Anglican ministry by a revised ecclesiastical court. So the new archbishop, the 5 guys on the ecclesiastical court knew Whittingham, knew his family, knew all about what he was teaching, and would not come against him. So what they did was, the new archbishop put 9 more people on the court that were his guys. And they all outvoted the other guys and brought charges against him. And the big charge was that he had never been officially made a priest in the Church of England. He had only been ordained as a Presbyterian on the continent. Now, never mind, he had come back, and the Anglican church that was existing at the time had made him the dean of Durham, and he had been preaching there and been widely accepted and loved for years. But now they're saying, oh, you weren't properly ordained by us, and so you're going to have to be properly ordained by us. And he said, no, that's just your way of getting me, into an argument that you'll kick me out anyway. And so he was removed from his deanship and kicked out of the official circles of the area. And so several years later, he died in poverty on 10th June 1579 and was buried in Durham Cathedral, where his tomb, ironically, was destroyed by the Presbyterian Scots in 1640. So what happened was, in 1579, because he had been the Dean of Durham and he went ahead and died, they said, okay, you can be buried. He told his family he could be buried in the actual cathedral. And then years later, when the Presbyterian Scots were fighting against England, they overwhelmed this cathedral and destroyed his tomb, even though he was one of the very first champions of Presbyterianism in England. Just because he was buried in an Anglican cathedral, they just destroyed everything carte blanche. So that's kind of all the pertinent background on William Whittingham. So, I want to make an honorable mention here for just a moment about Theodore Beza. Theodore Beza was Calvin's wingman. He was there throughout. He was the younger associate pastor, so to speak, under Calvin. But he was a scholar as well. And these two got together, the older now Beza and the younger Whittingham. And while they were on the continent in Geneva, in the middle of the Swiss Confederation protection, they were able to put together a wonderful version of the English Bible based on William Tyndale's translation. And so let's talk about Beza for just a moment, because he deserves an honorable mention. In 1565, he issued an edition of the Greek New Testament in 3 columns. The text of the Greek, the Vulgate, and a translation of his own, which he made in 1559. And so annotations were added, and they are also in the Geneva Bible, in the notes of the Geneva Bible, in the margins. Beza availed himself of the help of 2 very valuable ancient Greek manuscripts. One is known as the Codex Beza, and was later presented by Beza to the University of Cambridge and not Oxford. The second is the Codex Claromontanus, which Beza had found in Clermont, that is now in the Bibliothèque Nationale of France in Paris. Beza's labors in this direction were exceedingly helpful to those who came after. His Latin version of the New Testament was published every year for 100 years. And so he was a Latin scholar, he was a Greek scholar, and he was able to put together a Bible of his own that had the Greek in the first column, the Latin in the second column from the Old Latin, the Vetus Latina, and his own adaptation of it, sort of like the Message Bible is an adaptation, paraphrase of our Bible. And that way you were able to take it verse by verse and see the difference, and then you could see the difference in the Vulgate that had come down to them, and how the Vulgate was way off the mark. So that's why he's very important, because he and Whittingham got together on the Geneva Bible. First the New Testament and then the whole Bible. And as they were working on it, they were using Calvin's notes given to Theodore Beza. They were working with Miles Coverdale's translation and protecting of Tyndale's Bible. And that was there. And then while they were there, before John Knox went back to England, all this was taking place under Bloody Mary for 7 years. And so John Knox was there too. So you can imagine these guys in a room where you've got Miles Tyndale with all of Miles Coverdale with all of Tyndale's notes and commentaries and thoughts and memories of Tyndale, and then John Calvin's notes under Theodore Beza, and John Knox in the very room with his fiery Bible Presbyterianism, and William Whittingham bringing them all together with his scholarship to make sure that all the notes got in the right place and at the right time. He was the compiler with all of this other information of the Geneva edition of the Bible. Now, let's talk specifically about the Geneva Bible. These are actual pages from a Geneva Bible, and you'll notice that this is very different. If we put a King James Bible or a Bishop's Bible, any of the others that were in England at the time up against these, you would see just a title and straight text and no marginal notes at all. And so they started explaining things from the very beginning. The names and order of all the books of the Old and New Testament with the number of their chapters. That had never been done before in a Bible. And so you've got this list. We take all that for granted, but back in those days that was revolutionary. And there was what they call the argument, the introduction to each book. Before, there had never been anybody who was allowed to make an introduction to any of the books of the Bible. It just started with the title, and you just started with the text. And somebody had to explain to you what it was all about. And that's by design. That's how the clergy always keeps control of the people by keeping the knowledge away from them. Well, the Geneva Bible exploded all that because they put not only introductions, but they put marginal notes on almost every page. King James, when he came into his own, said, I hate that Geneva Bible. That Geneva Bible is full of heresies in the margins and in the notes. And I don't want that. And I want you guys, my scholars, to make my own version and only use that Geneva Bible where you have to for the text and leave out all that marginal stuff. Well, in the meantime, for 70 years, people had already had in English this Geneva Bible. Not only did it have introductions and marginal notes, but it had large pictures for the first time at the beginning of the books and the epistles, and it had maps and it had documents so that you could follow along and have some kind of context with what you were reading. So this was revolutionary at the time. It was the first study Bible because of all of this information, and it was the first Bible with numbered verses. Before that, it was just like the epistle of Paul to the Galatians. All the text, all the story, no numbered verses, so that you could pull out a verse and say, let's start with Galatians 1:15. You'd have to just start at 1 and go down to where you wanted to and hope that people could follow you and get to it. And so it was the first Bible with numbered verses. It was the first Bible with easy-to-read Roman typeface. Before that, they had the typeface that was all such flourishing, and some of the letters were very close together and typeface, and it looked pleasing to the eye, but it was horrible to be able to read for any amount of time. First Roman typeface. This is the version of the Bible that's quoted 970 times in Shakespeare's plays. Everybody thinks that's the King James Version, but Shakespeare evidently didn't own a King James Version. He owned a Geneva Bible because the quotes are in phraseology exactly from the Geneva Bible. 970 times in his plays, and a few more times than that in his sonnets and other things that he wrote, instructions. And so this was also the first Bible brought to America by the Pilgrims on the Mayflower. Why didn't the Pilgrims bring the King James Bible? They came in 1620. King James had his Bible out in 1611. Well, for the very same reason why they left England anyway. They left England because King James had his own Bible, his own interpreters, his own priests, and it was his own religion, and if you didn't agree with it, you could be put in prison. And so they didn't agree with it, and so why would they bring it to the New World with them? Why would they bring that Bible, King James's Bible? So they brought the Geneva Bible. Now, why was King James so much against this Geneva Bible? Well, it said things, and I've got an original 350-year-old Geneva leaf here, and this particular leaf says, "There is no power so high or mighty, but God will visit him with rods." Well, you can see why King James didn't like that. He was the king, and he was God's representative on earth. And they were saying in the Geneva Bible, there's no power so high or mighty that God can't get you if you don't do right by his people and his church. And all of these little yellow tabs that I have in here are all tabs having to do with the royalty, and if they don't pay attention to the people of God, then they're no better than a pagan. And so it was used as ammunition, church, religious, godly ammunition against the power of tyranny of the king. And so that's why he hated it. That's why the clergy hated it, because it took their power away. So, William Whittingham's lasting legacy, more than 150 editions of the Geneva Bible were printed up to 1715. It was the most influential version for over 100 years in England and for over 140 years in America. As a matter of fact, the King James Version of the Bible only became popular and overran the Geneva Bible when the publishers, King James died, and in 1649 the publishers printed a new version of the King James Bible and put all the Geneva notes and intros and maps in it, and then it sold like wildfire. And so it was secondary in all of King James' life. His Bible was not accepted by most of the people of England, even though all of us over here are thinking, oh, King James Bible, that's the biggest, best, and always was. No, not until the last 50 or 75 years in this country, actually. It was the Bible of choice for 140 years in America. And most importantly for us, it's the Bible version on which our government, federal and state, was founded. Our government's laws and polity and how we set things up were based on what God gave in the Old Testament and the New Testament as organizational polity. And people have written entire books about that, so I won't take the time to try to go into any of that tonight. But this is the version that our government was set up on, and most people do not know it at all. Next week, we're going to finish out our 12 disciples of the English Bible and do a little review. And so we're going to be studying about John Knox, and there's some fascinating stories about John Knox and what he went through and how he began the Presbyterian Church in Scotland. We'll take that on next week. Let's pray.